Life's a rally, ride it! That's the new slogan of the Kawasaki KLE 500. But how much rally is really in it, and whether it might actually just be an A2 travel enduro with a road focus and a good marketing brochure, that's what we're looking at today, here in the Tabernas Desert and the surrounding area.
Und Umgebung wird leibend.
But before things heat up in this video, let's do a quick technical overview so we're all on the same page. The heart of the KLE 500 is of course the already familiar 451 cubic centimeter parallel twin, from the Z500 or Ninja 500. Here it makes 45.4 horsepower at 9,000 revs per minute and 42.6 Newton meters of torque at 6,000 revs. Otherwise, I'd say we've got a pretty classic A2 travel enduro here. Weight-wise, in the standard version, we're at 194 kilograms, ready to ride. And in the SE version, which you can see here and which we rode exclusively, that's 1 kilogram more, 195 kilograms. Suspension travel is fairly long, 210 millimeters at the front, 196 millimeters at the rear, and we'll come back to the much discussed ground clearance of 185 millimeters. Speaking of which, I've just mentioned it, we rode the SE version. There are two versions of the new KLE 500. So what are the differences? The differences are mainly in the equipment. The base model still has an old school LCD display, whereas here we have a TFT display that's already familiar from other Kawasaki models. On the SE version, you also get handguards, a taller windscreen, a more substantial skid plate or engine guard, and LED light elements, indicators and so on. On the base version, those are still classic old school. And what about the electronics? Here we have, like on the other 500 Kawasaki models, traction control on board, ABS that can be switched off, and of course smartphone connectivity comes with the display as well. Kawasaki have also expanded that radiology app they've had for years a bit in terms of functions, because we now have better, further developed voice control options. Right before we get to the really exciting bits, let's briefly talk about everyday usability, because that matters on an A2 adventure bike. People call it a beginner's bike too, although I don't really like reducing this class, which I'm very fond of, to that, because these days it isn't only for beginners. We know the story, displacement, horsepower, the arms race in the motorcycle market, everything gets bigger, stronger, more and more. And because of that, plenty of people who are no longer beginners at all are looking at the less is more end of things. So how well does that work here on the KLE 500? The riding position, in principle, we've got a seat height of 870 millimeters. According to Kawasaki, they had a rider of 1.80 meters in mind. During development, I'm 1.85 meters tall. You can see it works out very comfortably for me. But even for noticeably smaller riders, I'd say there's no need to worry. We've got a very narrow midsection here, which makes it very easy to reach the ground with both feet. At the other end of the spectrum, I also think taller people fit the KLE quite well. Firstly, there's plenty of space to shuffle a bit forwards and a bit backwards. The knee angle is very relaxed, meaning even with long legs it should work well in terms of space. There aren't really any annoying edges either, and the handlebars are quite high up. You sit properly travel enduro style in the saddle of the KLE, so even though I'm tall, the bars aren't uncomfortably close or too low. There should still be room for arms, elbows and the proper riding position, even for 1.90 meters plus. We started here, naturally in town, and had several small villages along the way. And when you're just calmly working your way through these narrow Spanish roads, you feel completely at ease. And that's part of everyday usability. The engine responds nicely, only very rarely do you get a small load change jerk that you can't smooth out. But it's still at a totally acceptable level and not really annoying in my view. It's also no surprise that the engine or the throttle response works well. After all, This 451 parallel twin isn't exactly new anymore. The KLE's handling is nicely playful and the center of gravity isn't too high. That means even at low speeds, together with the very light assist clutch, turning, stopping and setting off again is all pretty easy. For beginners that should work well too. The 6-speed gearbox is crisp and not vague. You always know exactly where you are. And you can also lug this engine down quite a bit. If you're being lazy with shifts, 50 kilometers an hour in 6th or 5th, no problem at all. But luckily we weren't only riding through villages. At some point the town sign ended and we were unleashed onto these truly beautiful Spanish country roads, which is where I'm speaking to you from now. And yes, that means I'm out in the Spanish backwoods on a small, really lovely twisty road over the mountains, heading back towards the coast and the hotel. Because here's the great thing with Kawasaki presentations. You often get a little tom-tom strapped on and then it's free riding. And that's the best way, I think, to look for your own impressions and use the bike calmly outside a rushed presentation schedule, just like you personally would. So I focused on the country road strengths, both relaxed, longer distance riding and also a bit of angles when it gets tight and twisty. And you have to say, the KLE 500 works really well. Firstly, the engine. Yes, you do have to rev it quite hard if you want to ride sportily. You need to spin it up and hunt for the top third of the rev range. But that's no surprise with a 451 cubic centimeter parallel twin. They simply need revs. It doesn't feel unpleasant, even though up there in that upper third you can feel higher frequency vibrations. But for me, they're absolutely within an acceptable range. That also applies when you ride a bit of distance. At 120 kilometers an hour, you're sitting at about 7,000 revs. So at our motorway speed, you'd probably be heading towards 8,000. I couldn't try that today on the Spanish roads. If you're sensitive in your hands, the vibrations might bother you. For me, it was absolutely fine. What I find more suboptimal is the windscreen. Even though we've got the SE version and therefore the taller screen, at my 1.85 meters, the wind hits me around nose tip height. I also get fairly loud turbulence down the sides of the helmet. You can adjust the windscreen as it's currently in the lowest position, but I don't think it's solved in a particularly slick way. What's the best way to show it? You can see here, you have to undo 2 screws per side. Then you've got the second and third position with 27 and 55 millimeters more. And yes, even in this entry-level class, there are systems with some kind of latch you can operate, maybe even while riding, which would obviously be nice. I also can't say how good the wind protection is in the higher positions because I couldn't just adjust it on the go without tools. As it is, for my height, it's a bit meh. What isn't meh? And for me, the biggest star of the KLE on the road is the suspension. Even though it isn't adjustable, even though we're in an affordable class, the suspension is, I think, very surprisingly stable. It doesn't start rocking. Even if you really spear into a corner, it draws a nice line, follows the line you've got in your head. Even over bumps, sure, it does squish. It's tuned for comfort, so it moves around. But after you ride over the bump, it settles again fairly quickly. There's no big wallowing, and I really like that. It builds confidence. The KLE's behavior is predictable, and even when you let it rip a bit, you still feel comfortable. Of course, because the suspension is fundamentally soft, if you carry speed into a corner, it does dip a little, and in stock form, we've got those roughly 3 centimeter long feelers. They touch down pretty early. If you shorten them a bit, there might be more in it. But even as it is, I had really good fun. To be fair, with a presentation like this, we ride 2 days and just over 200 kilometers. So you can do the maths. That isn't much. And because of that, statements on things like seat comfort are limited. We've also got under where your sit bones are, roughly at this height, a hollow area inside, like a hollow tube, that's meant to improve comfort and be kinder to your backside on longer stints. But with what we rode, and especially with lots and lots of breaks in between, that's simply not meaningful. Same goes for fuel consumption. We're currently at a pretty low figure of 5.3 liters. Yes, but with the journalist hooning going on here, that doesn't say much either. I'm assuming that in real-world use, with a normal right hand, you'll probably come in comfortably under 5 liters with this engine and this bike. Maybe one more word on the bike's behavior. It's very light on its feet. We've got a relatively narrow rear tire or a fairly round profile. It tips into lean very willingly. You don't need much input through the quite wide handlebars. I think that's cohesive. It feels very travel enduro-like in the way it rides. At the same time, the front brake is on the softer side, but it's nicely controllable. If you want to brake harder, it's best to add the rear brake as well, which is clearly positioned for off-road. You have to lift your foot a bit. I think that's purely a habit thing. And it also has relatively little pedal travel, which isn't a big drama on tarmac. Off-road, it's a bit harder to modulate, but that's complaining at a high level. Overall, I'd say on tarmac, the KLE has really respectable performance, and it's good for everything from touring to having fun.
Touren bis zum Spaß haben. So, und zu guter Letzt jetzt noch ein Wort.
And lastly, a quick word about the KLE's exhaust. We were riding differently equipped bikes, all SE versions, but here I've got the standard exhaust. You know it, it's very flat and points rearwards. And then there's an Akrapovic that angles up much more steeply. That was the bike I rode first. Is it worth it? The Akrapovic exhaust is part of the rally accessory package, and as far as I could tell, we even did some side-by-side throttle blips listening for nuances. They sound pretty much the same, so don't expect a big acoustic upgrade if you buy the Akrapovic. We're living in Euro 5 plus times, unfortunately, but there's another complication or quirk with it because it sits much steeper. Visually, I do think that's an upgrade. It simply looks better overall, that Akrapovic, but it sits so high that you end up clashing with the luggage option. It's genuinely the case that Kawasaki's original KLE accessories include hard side cases alongside a top box, and on the right-hand side that no longer works. It's not compatible with the Akrapovic exhaust, so you can only have one of the two. And even if you imagine using a soft luggage system, especially if you're off-road, you'll probably have something like that at home, it could still be tight, judging by it. So yes, Akrapovic looks nicer, doesn't really sound better, and can potentially collide with luggage. Think carefully about that and how you want to spend your money. Right, and with that, I think it's time to continue on my way. The adventure qualities are still waiting for me, and that's what I'm really interested in.
Reden wir über die Abenteuerqualitäten der KLE 500.
Let's talk about the KLE 500's adventure qualities. And we'll start with the point that got discussed the most beforehand. In the marketing material, you could see that even on the smallest jump, this skid plate almost bottomed out. My phone, a Samsung S23 Ultra, is 17.3 centimeters on the diagonal. And you can see that even on this uneven ground where we're standing now, which probably has a bit more roughness, there isn't much space left. And on paper, 185 millimeters, that isn't much. It's just above what many naked bikes have and quite a long way from the 25 to even 30 centimeters that proper off-road machines offer. And if you look at how the KLE is built, you can see it clearly here. The engine itself would sit high enough, but the header routing runs underneath the engine. Then you also have this extra part, the black section of the frame. And altogether, of course, that takes away even more ground clearance. So the question is, why was it designed like that? I hadn't managed to catch a developer, so I'm going to show you the answer I did get. The Japanese developer's answer was actually very logical and simple. The headers and the routing exhaust are part of the drivetrain. They wanted to stay as close as possible to the predecessor models, the sister models Z500 and Ninja 500. And even if they had only routed the headers differently, it would have triggered a whole knock-on effect with homologation and so on, which would have driven costs up. And cost pressure is simply part of a model in this segment. They also said the ground clearance isn't such a big issue for the KLE and its positioning in the segment, so they basically carried it over from the Z500 and Ninja 500. Right, so now we know that. But what's it actually like in practice? At the presentation, we mainly rode light unpaved routes, gravel roads, dirt roads. Here and there were a few stones, little mogul jump ramps, so to speak. I also actively try to hit those, and with the rather comfort-focused, non-adjustable suspension, you can of course push it if you want. But when you consider who this bike is made for, and that it doesn't want to present itself as the ultimate off-road machine anyway, in the end I actually think it's okay. Yes, you do have to watch out a bit in places, but today, even with a bit more enthusiastic throttle and a brisker pace, the ground clearance wasn't actually a big limiting factor. So I think we can keep things in perspective. And there are other points regarding adventure qualities that I'd criticize more strongly. But before I get to those, let's talk about the basic stuff first. For example, what's the standing position like on the KLE? That's done well. I'd say it's more on the touring side. The handlebars are very high, so on flat ground you can stand there really relaxed without much strain in your back if you want to. You can hold that for a long time. On the flip side, as soon as it goes a bit uphill, you tend to cling to the bars, because there isn't that much space between the fairly centrally positioned foot pegs and the very high handlebars, which obviously come towards you when climbing. Overall though, that's not really a negative point, because for a bike where you might be getting your first experience on loose ground, it fits. It also has a nice narrow midsection. So knee grip works well, and you've got room to move back and forward, so you can shift your feet a bit, look for balance, and actively move around in the saddle. If anything, the tank is actually a bit slippery as standard because it's smooth plastic. So my first tweak or wish would be to stick some pads on the sides just to have more friction there. Same with the standard foot pegs. You can simply remove the rubber and then you've got proper toothed steel pegs. Even so, I find the stock pegs a bit narrow. That's more a comfort thing. I'd fit wider ones. But overall, ergonomically, it's sound and it sits in a range where you can choose between touring riding or starting to play around a bit. For proper active off-road racers, it's not intended. To be fair, in that standing position, the KLE's handling is actually pretty exemplary. It doesn't feel too top-heavy. It's not like a Tenere or something that can get twitchy at low speed. And it's not exactly featherweight either. We're talking 195 kilograms ready to ride in the SE version and 194 in the non-SE. Most off-road riders will probably go for the SE anyway because of the handguards and proper engine protection. And yes, the weight isn't that far off a Tenere, but it still feels noticeably lighter because it's simply lower. So it follows your input through the foot pegs and a bit through the wide handlebars really nicely. It feels intuitive quite quickly on those flowing gravel and dirt roads we rode here around the Tabernas Desert. And you really should take a look at where we are. Classic spaghetti western filming location. Normally you're not even allowed to ride here, but we got a special permit. But the surrounding area with the tracks we rode is genuinely a dream. And following those flowing roads is effortless with the KLE. The engine is also nicely tuned. Sure, on the road, like I said, you need revs for power. Off-road, that's still true, but for the kind of rider and the average off-road skill level, you'll see on a KLE, I think it fits. Because it's not as gutless as some other A2 travel enduros. I'll name one example, my big criticism of the KTM 390 Adventure R, which otherwise is the uncompromising travel enduro or enduro bike in this class. That engine, taken from a naked bike or other non-off-road categories, only delivers its power later on. And here on the KLE, it isn't quite like that. Yes, it's still a twin. Yes, if you want close to maximum power, you do need that last third of the rev range. But down low, it doesn't feel so weak-chested. You don't get the feeling that when you're crawling along slowly, sand was the arch enemy again today. The engine's about to stall. There's a bit of flywheel effect behind it. And in the mid-range, there's enough power to give yourself a quick shove forward with a throttle blip. So overall, the engine's adaptation, so to speak, to enduro use is well done. We've also got different gearing here on the KLE. 15 teeth at the front, 46 at the rear, if I'm not mistaken. And they've also tweaked the ECU mapping a bit to suit off-road use better. My verdict, it feels suitably matched and harmonious. So what's it like on loose ground in terms of suspension? Surprisingly good. Just like on the road, I also find the KLE stability off-road with this non-adjustable suspension is genuinely very presentable. It works well, no big wallowing, predictable. Clearly it's on the comfort softer side. Especially the fork. If you ride at a higher pace and then there are harsh bumps, holes or transverse ruts, and you go in with speed without first unweighting the front wheel and shifting your weight back, then you'll smash through pretty unfiltered right to the stops. So it's definitely still a suspension setup that prefers a more relaxed pace, but it remains predictable and there's still that potential to play around a bit. And if you think about early off-road steps, there's more than enough reserve to have a bit of fun. If you're not demanding super fast suspension movement, then with over 200 millimeters of travel up front and 196 at the rear, you've got a fair bit in hand, right? And the last off-road point is about braking and ABS. The ABS is very easy and quick to switch off, but only when stationary, but that's standard these days. Press twice, hold on the second press, bang, ABS off. But there's only ABS fully off. Not like on many others where you first get a mode with rear ABS off only and then fully off if you want. Here it's all or nothing. For beginners, I always found the modes where only the rear is off pretty good, because the big crash risk is when the front locks. At the rear you can play with traction fairly quickly and I'd say without too much danger. I'd like the KLE to have that, but it doesn't. Otherwise, quickly on the brakes. The front brake is typically off-road oriented, a bit defensive and soft, but I think it's well tuned, nicely controllable, predictable. The rear has a bit too little pedal travel before the pads bite hard and the rear wheel locks. That'll also depend on what tires you've got fitted. With grippier tires you might have a bigger range to modulate. As we had it, even with road-leaning tires, on loose ground it was more like 0 or 1. Small criticism there, but overall I'd say the brakes are absolutely fine and as you'd expect.
Die Bremsen absolut passabel und so, wie man sich das erwartet.
If you've seen an adventure bike test from me before, you'll know it's not only about how an off-road bike rides. Because when you're typically far from civilization, it can happen, as I know from experience, that you're on your own and have to sort problems out. So you also have to look at practicality. First point, for example, the onboard toolkit is rather meager. A Phillips screwdriver, a 14 and a 12 spanner, and a hex key. Yes, there are motorcycles where you get a bit more. Same with, for example, changing the air filter. If you're riding in dusty countries like we were today, then after a few days at the latest, you'll want to change the air filter. On the KLE, it sits roughly under the tank. That means a quick roadside service isn't that easy, because you first have to remove the seat, take off the side panels, remove the tank, or at least loosen it so you can tilt it up, and only then can you get to the airbox. Not ideal either. But the bigger criticism I mentioned earlier is about the wheel dimensions. In principle, we've got spoked wheels with tubes, which I always like. I'm team tube, not tubeless. Up front we've got the classic 90/90 on a 21-inch wheel, that's fine. But at the rear it's 140/70 on a 17-inch wheel. And I asked why they chose that size. The best reason I was given was, well, because it used to be like that on the KLE. I don't think that's a good justification. The problem is, with the IRC Trail Winner as standard, we've already got pretty much the maximum you can get out of this rear dimension, because it's a very unusual size. 140/80 would be much better, or 150/70. But 140/70 on 17, there are hardly any tires for that, beyond very road-biased ones. I'm thinking of something like a Metzeler Karoo 3, for example, but anything more aggressive is very hard to find. Even IRC, which we have as standard here, doesn't have an official importer in Europe, so you first have to track them down somehow. And it's also a long way from properly knobbly, which is what you might want if you were going after rougher sections of something like the TET. And I'll admit, personally, this really bothers me, because I think I have to compensate for my lack of riding skill with what I can, and good tires are the most logical and quickest option. And then, just because of a weird rear size not really having that option, sure, you can try to botch it with wider or taller tires, but especially in countries like Germany, where tire approvals can be legally tricky, you're basically opening Pandora's box with an unusual rear dimension that, in my view, didn't need opening. And I need to add a correction on the rear wheel size. I also asked the Japanese developer, and it's not correct that these were the old KLE dimensions. Those were 130/80, as I was told later. So why this unusual size? They looked at which tires are chosen on the road-oriented side of the segment and which on the off-road-oriented side, and concluded that 140 is the perfect tire width. Fair enough, but why 140/70? Why not 140/80? That would have eased the problem. They couldn't really tell me that. And one more interesting side fact on why this is a problem, beyond legality, is modern electronics. If you fit, say, 140/80 tires, you change the rolling circumference, and then the electronics gets confused. A fault code appears pretty quickly, and ABS drops out, which could potentially be dangerous. So, really suboptimal rear tire dimension, and for me the biggest weakness of the KLE 500, right? And with that we're already at the end of this presentation video. Time for a conclusion, a summary. And I think the easiest way to place the KLE is to look at this now massively grown A2 travel enduro segment. What's the closest competition? In my opinion, given parallel twin engines and fairly similar price brackets, we are mainly talking about the CFMoto 450 MT and the Honda NX500. And with the KLE, the question for me is the same one from the beginning. How much rally is really in it, or is it perhaps just a road-oriented, in quotation marks of course, travel enduro? It's not a Honda NX500. That 21-inch front wheel simply gives it more possibilities. It also has much longer suspension travel, and even with the criticized ground clearance, it's still 5 millimeters more than the Honda NX500. At the same time, you also have to say it's not really a competitor to the CFMoto 450 MT if you want to go off-road, because we've already discussed it. Firstly, the ground clearance and also the rear wheel size. There are a few factors that show it clearly. This isn't a no-compromise off-road machine. It positions itself, I think, exactly between those two rivals. It can be a purely road-used, calm, relaxed travel enduro that, if the mood takes you, offers that little bit more in reserve, a bit more potential to experience a few adventures on loose ground, which I might not dare quite as much on a Honda NX500. And at the same time, yes, as explained, the difference to the 450 MT, which is being talked up in off-road circles as a lighter but still very capable travel enduro, it doesn't even want to go there. It hits the middle almost perfectly. And it hits that middle, I think, as a very rounded overall package that hardly puts a foot wrong. Yes, the windscreen could be improved a bit, and I've mentioned the rear wheel. That's my biggest criticism, because it's simply an unnecessary limitation for this bike, and otherwise two small things. We've got loads of accessories, 3 different accessory packages. One is a rally package with a nice continuous seat, because you get a pillion seat that's 30 millimeters lower, and the Akrapovic exhaust. Then there's an adventure tourer, a touring package with luggage and so on. And then there's also a top gas package, but unfortunately it doesn't exist. Like with the other 500 Kawasaki models, cruise control and a quick shifter. Even though we have ride-by-wire, and it wouldn't be that hard to implement technically, somehow still aren't part of the zeitgeist, as if the A2 travel enduro class doesn't deserve to have cruise control, not even for good money. Maybe that'll change, but as the KLE stands here, I think it's very successful. And you also have to say, it's Kawasaki's first step into this off-road segment after a long time. And I'm curious to see how it'll hold its own in this fiercely competitive area. Because price-wise, we're also quite attractive. Just under 7,100 euros here in Austria, and just under 6,500 euros for the basic standard version of the KLE 500 in Germany. And the SE version costs roughly 800 euros more. So again, on a level footing. But level footing also means the others have low prices and good value too. So I don't dare make a prediction about whether this motorcycle will actually be successful on the market or not. That's for you to decide, you customers out there. I definitely wish it well, that it does establish itself a bit, or at least that the next comparison tests here with us at 1000 PS turn out really tight and exciting. To not miss them, it's best to subscribe to the channel. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and I say thank you very much for watching. We'll definitely see each other again soon. Take care and goodbye.
Und ich sage herzlichen Dank fürs Zuschauen. Wir sehen uns sicher bald wieder. Pfiat euch und Baba.